I have always believed the quietest nights remember the most. That thought came back to me one autumn evening, when I turned onto an old county road that barely appeared on any map. The field stretched farther than my headlights could reach, their rows moving gently beneath a sky filled with stars that seemed strangely close. Every farmhouse I passed sat dark and empty, as though the people inside had chosen not to look outside after sunset. I cracked the truck window, just enough to let the cool air in. It carried the scent of dry corn leaves and distant rain that never quite arrived. Somewhere beyond the fields, a windmill turned with slow, tired creaks, then stopped without warning. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. My father used to tell me that country nights were honest. If something wants to be found, he'd say, "It won't hide forever." I laughed at those words when I was younger. That night, I remembered every one of them. The road narrowed until it became little more than packed dirt. My headlights caught something standing between two rows of corn. Not a scarecrow, not a person, and not an animal I recognized. It remained perfectly still as I drove closer. I slowed, almost without thinking. The radio faded into quiet. The stars above the field seemed to disappear one by one. That's when I realized it wasn't standing in the corn. The corn was growing around it. Late September has a way of making the countryside feel older than it is. That evening, the sun had already slipped behind the low hills when I found myself driving along Miller Road, a narrow stretch of cracked pavement that hardly anyone used anymore. Thin clouds drifted across the sky, leaving only a few stars to shine between them. The fields on either side looked endless, their dry stalks swaying gently in the fading light. I had taken the road only because I wanted a quieter drive home. My father used to say that the long way was often the better way. He liked roads that had no hurry in them. Whenever I smelled damp earth after a cool day, I think of him walking across his garden with muddy boots, humming to himself while the evening settled around the house. That memory stayed with me as I rounded a slow bend. Something pale drifted between the rows of corn. At first I thought it was someone carrying a flashlight, but the light was too soft. Almost blue, it floated without shaking, gliding deeper into the field before pausing as though it had noticed my truck. I eased onto the gravel shoulder and turned off the engine. The headlights remained on. For a moment, the only sound came from insects hidden somewhere beyond the ditch. Then the crickets stopped, not one after another, all at once. The silence left behind seemed larger than the field itself. I rolled down the window a few inches. Cool evening air slipped inside, carrying the rich smell of damp earth mixed with drying corn leaves. Nothing moved except the faint blue glow resting halfway between two distant rows. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Someone checking irrigation. Teenagers playing a joke. Anything ordinary felt welcome. I climbed out anyway. Gravel shifted beneath my boots as I crossed toward an old mailbox leaning beside the entrance to the field. The red paint had almost disappeared beneath years of weather, and one hinge squeaked softly when I opened the little metal door. Inside rested a newspaper. It looked fresh. The edges were crisp. I pulled it into the fading light. Tomorrow's date stretched across the top of the front page. Someone had crossed out today's date with a thick black line. I stared at it longer than I should have. For a strange moment, I wondered whether I had forgotten what day it was. I checked my watch, then my phone. Both agreed with the date I already knew. The paper did not. A faint breeze brushed across the field, carrying the dry rustling of corn farther inside. The blue light had moved again. Not much, just enough that I noticed. I stepped beyond the mailbox and followed the narrow dirt path leading between the first rows. The stalks stood taller than I remembered, hiding the horizon almost immediately. Their leaves brushed lightly against my sleeves, making a soft whisper that faded whenever I stopped walking. The glow remained ahead, always ahead, never closer. It reminded me of those nights as a child when I chased fireflies across my grandparents' yard, convinced I could catch one if I stayed patient enough. I never did. My grandmother used to laugh from the porch and tell me some lights belonged where they were. I wished I had remembered that sooner. The path opened just enough for me to see across another section of the field. The blue light disappeared. Not faded, disappeared. The darkness that replaced it felt complete. My eyes searched every row. Nothing. only pale moonlight resting across the tops of the corn. Then I noticed someone standing near the far edge of the field. The distance made it impossible to tell whether it was a man or a woman. The figure never waved, never turned. It simply faced my direction without moving. I lifted one hand halfway before thinking better of it. No reply came. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time seemed difficult to measure there. The clouds slowly drifted away, revealing more stars overhead. Their light gave the field a silver edge, yet the person remained only a dark outline against the horizon. I considered calling out. Instead, I listened. Nothing answered. Even the breeze had gone quiet. A cool feeling sailed across my shoulders, not from the temperature, but from the growing sense that I had stayed longer than I should have. The eastern sky began to lose a little of its darkness. Morning was approaching. The distant figure looked no different than before. I walked back without looking over my shoulder. Each step toward the truck felt easier than the last, as though the road itself wanted me to leave before daylight arrived. The engine started on the first try. That alone felt comforting. I drove away with the windows closed and both hands steady on the wheel. Only after several miles did I stop at an empty crossroads to collect myself. I stepped outside. The morning air carried the clean scent of fresh grass. Birds had begun singing again. Everything looked ordinary. Then I noticed the ground behind my truck. Fresh tire tracks stretched across the damp dirt. 2 clear lines. They began several yards behind where my truck was parked, not beneath the tires. Behind them, as though another truck had been following mine so closely that somehow it had left without ever passing me. I stood there until the first sunlight reached the road. Even then, I couldn't make myself walk back to see where those tracks came from. The farmhouse sat at the end of the gravel lane I almost missed. It was early October, just after sunset, when the last warmth of the day had begun to fade from the fields. The sky carried a soft orange line along the horizon, while the first stars appeared above the empty pasture behind the house. I had been driving for nearly an hour without seeing another car, and the quiet road felt like it had been forgotten long before I found it. The porch was the first thing I noticed. A wooden swing moved back and forth with slow, gentle rhythm. There wasn't enough breeze to stir the tall grass beside the steps, yet the swing never rested. I pulled my truck onto the shoulder and sat for a moment with the engine running. The place looked abandoned. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips. One upstairs window had been covered with old boards. The front gate leaned sideways, held together by little more than rusted wire. I told myself the motion had to be simple. Old chains, an uneven floor, something ordinary. After turning off the truck, I stepped onto the gravel. The evening carried a faint warmth, and with it came the unmistakable scent of old candle wax. It drifted through the air as though someone had blown out dozens of candles only moments before. I looked toward the windows. Every one of them was dark. My grandmother used to light candles whenever the power went out. Their soft glow made the whole house feel smaller, safer somehow. That smell had always reminded me of evenings spent reading beside her while rain tapped gently against the roof. Standing outside that farmhouse, the same scent felt strangely out of place. The swing creaked again, once, then again. Its slow rhythm never changed. I climbed the porch steps carefully. The wood bent beneath my weight, but held firm. The swing passed in front of me, then drifted back again, empty from one end to the other. The seat was dry. No leaves rested on it, as though someone had been using it every day. Near the front door stood a narrow table covered in dust. A single picture frame rested against the wall. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up. The photograph showed a family of 5 standing on this very porch. A man, a woman, 3 children. At least, that was what I thought. Then my eyes settled on the far left side of the picture. Another figure stood slightly apart from the family. Tall, thin, its face reflected bright moonlight, though the rest of the photograph had clearly been taken during the day. The reflection wasn't a glare on the glass. I tilted the frame. The silver face remained exactly where it was. None of the family seemed aware it was standing beside them. A chill worked its way through my hands. I placed the photograph back exactly where I found it. The swing continued moving. The house remained silent. I tried the front door. Locked. Of course. Part of me felt relieved. Another part wondered who had locked it. I stepped away from the entrance and walked toward the side of the porch. The boards groaned softly beneath each step. Dry vines climbed the support posts, disappearing beneath the railing. That was when I heard it. My name. Quiet. Barely louder than a breath. It came from below the porch. I froze. The voice hadn't sounded angry or frightened. It had sounded familiar. Not familiar enough to recognize. Just enough to make me hesitate. The space beneath the porch was hidden behind loose wooden boards, leaving only narrow gaps where darkness settled. I listened. Nothing. Even the swing had stopped moving. For several long moments, I wondered if I had imagined it. My heartbeat had become the loudest thing I could hear. I crouched slowly and looked toward one of the openings. There was only darkness beneath the floor. No movement. No animal. No person. The smell of candle wax seemed stronger there, mixed now with the faint scent of dry timber that had aged through countless seasons. I almost stood up. Instead, without thinking too much about it, I spoke. Hello. The word felt much louder than I intended. It disappeared beneath the porch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then someone answered. Not from beneath the house. Not from the field. Not from inside. The reply came from somewhere I couldn't place at all. Soft. Gentle. Only a single word. Hello. The voice sounded almost exactly like mine. I backed away so quickly that one heel caught against the porch step. The photograph slipped from the table and landed face down on the wood with a muted thud. I didn't stop to pick it up. By the time I reached the truck, the stars had filled most of the sky. The porch looked empty again. The swing had become perfectly still. I started the engine and drove away without checking the mirrors. The road carried me through miles of quiet farmland before I finally convinced myself to breathe normally again. Every explanation I thought of seemed reasonable for a few seconds. Old houses settle. Voices echo. Pictures catch strange reflections. Yet, one question stayed with me for the rest of the drive. When I had whispered hello beneath that porch, who had been polite enough to answer? The diner appeared where the highway bent around a stretch of empty farmland. It was close to midnight in late October, and a light rain had passed through less than an hour before. The pavement still reflected the yellow glow from the old sign above the entrance. Most of the letters had burned out years ago, leaving only DIER shining against the darkness. I hadn't planned to stop, but I had been driving since evening, and the road had become so quiet that I found myself missing the sound of another person's voice. The parking lot held only my truck. Beyond it, the fields disappeared beneath the night, broken only by a distant fence and a line of telephone poles fading into the horizon. As I stepped inside, a small bell above the door gave a single clear ring. Warm air greeted me. It carried the rich scent of fresh coffee mixed with cinnamon, the kind my mother used to sprinkle into the pot during the first cold weeks of autumn. For a moment, I almost forgot how lonely the road had felt. The diner was small, 6 booths, a long counter, a pie display that held only one untouched apple pie. Everything looked clean, but strangely untouched, as though the room had been waiting for someone to arrive. The waitress looked up from behind the counter and smiled. You made it before closing. Her voice was calm, almost relieved. I nodded and slid into the booth nearest the window. She brought a steaming mug of coffee, without asking what I wanted. I thanked her. The coffee tasted sweeter than I expected. Not unpleasant, just different enough that I noticed. As I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, my eyes drifted toward the clocks hanging behind the counter. There were 4 of them, none matched. One showed 11:48. Another had just passed midnight. The third rested at nearly 1 o'clock. The last one had no second hand at all. I frowned. Busy keeping different time zones? I asked with a quiet smile. The waitress looked toward the clocks. Oh, they've always done that. She didn't offer another explanation. Neither did I. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the glass, while the empty highway stretched into darkness. I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly 40 minutes. The silence inside the diner felt comfortable at first. Then I noticed something odd. The waitress glanced toward the booth across from mine every few minutes. not at me, past me, as though checking whether someone needed a refill. Eventually, she walked over carrying a second coffee pot. She stopped beside my table. "You two doing all right?" I looked up. "I'm the only one here." She blinked. A puzzled expression crossed her face. "No." She spoke gently, almost apologetically. "You haven't been alone since you came in." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because I wasn't sure what else to do. She seemed completely sincere. "I think you're mistaken." For a few seconds, she didn't answer. Then she leaned closer. "I've filled the other cup twice already." She walked back toward the counter before I could reply. My eyes lowered, almost by instinct. Across from me sat another coffee cup, half empty. Steam still drifted from its surface. I was certain it hadn't been there before. I stared at it, so long that my own coffee began to cool. My memory searched every moment since sitting down. Had I simply overlooked it? That seemed impossible. The booth wasn't large. The cup rested directly in front of the opposite seat. The waitress continued wiping the counter without looking my way. I reached toward the second mug. Its ceramic sides were warm. Someone had been holding it. I pulled my hand back. A faint feeling settled into the room. Not fear exactly. More like the uneasy certainty that I had walked into the middle of something without understanding it. The overhead lights flickered once. Only once. The reflections in the windows shifted with them. For just an instant, I thought I saw two people sitting at my booth. Then the glass returned to showing only me. I rubbed my eyes. The image was gone. My father used to tell me that tired minds enjoy filling empty places with familiar shapes. I repeated that thought several times. It helped, at least for a while. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and thanked the waitress. She accepted the money with a tired smile. As I reached the door, she spoke quietly behind me. "I hope your friend finds a road." I turned. She had already gone back to cleaning the counter. I almost asked what she meant. Instead, I stepped outside. The cool night carried the clean scent of rain-washed asphalt and distant fields. The parking lot remained empty except for my truck. I looked around carefully. No other cars. No movement. Only the faint glow spilling from the diner's windows. Then I noticed the ground. The damp gravel preserved every footprint clearly. One trail led from the diner to my truck. Mine. Another set should have crossed beside it if someone had truly been sitting with me. There wasn't one. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. The engine started easily. Before pulling away, I looked back through the diner window. The booth where I had been sitting looked empty. Only one coffee cup rested on the table. The second had vanished. As the diner disappeared behind me, I reached for the radio to break the quiet. Before my hand touched the dial, every station became silent. The grain elevator stood alone beyond the edge of Harper County, with a field stretched so far that the horizon looked like a faded pencil line against the night sky. It was the first week of November. The harvest had already ended, leaving the land open and bare beneath a bright moon. The road leading there was little more than packed gravel, and weeds had begun claiming both shoulders. I almost turned around twice, telling myself there couldn't be anything worth seeing at a place that had been abandoned for decades. Then I saw the elevator rising above the fields. Its concrete walls caught the moonlight, making it seem taller than I remember from old photographs. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, though one section had fallen flat years ago. I stepped through the opening. The cold night carried the dry scent of dust and weathered wood. Somewhere high above, loose metal shifted with a slow scrape that faded almost as soon as it began. My grandfather had worked in grain storage when he was young. He once told me that empty elevators never truly felt empty. The walls remembered every season that had passed through them. Standing there, I found myself thinking about that more than I expected. The main door stood half open. I slipped inside. Moonlight reached through broken windows near the roof, falling in long pale beams that revealed countless drifting specks of dust. Every breath stirred tiny clouds that shimmered before settling again. Rusted chains hung from old machinery overhead. One of them swayed gently, back and forth. There wasn't enough breeze to explain it. The building answered my footsteps with quiet echoes that disappeared into the upper levels. Each sound seemed slower coming back, as though the elevator needed an extra moment to decide whether to return it. I found the narrow stairway leading upward. The steel railing felt rough beneath my hand. Each step groaned softly beneath my weight. Halfway to the second level, I stopped, not because I was tired, because I noticed something on the landing ahead. Footprints. They crossed the dusty floor in a perfectly straight line. Unlike everything around them, they weren't covered in dust at all. Their surfaces reflected the moonlight with a smooth shine, almost like polished glass. I knelt beside one. It wasn't wet. It wasn't icy. When I reached toward it, my fingers met nothing unusual, just old concrete. Yet the print continued reflecting light, as though another surface rested inside it. There were no footprints leading to them, none leading away, only that single trail stretching toward the center of the building. For reasons I still can't explain, I followed. Each step carried me deeper into the elevator until I reached a wide platform overlooking the empty grain bins below. The polished footprints ended there. Nothing else. No ladder. No doorway. Only open space. I stood quietly listening. Far below, a loose piece of metal tapped once against another. Then everything became still again. I looked out through a broken window. The field spread beneath the moon like pale waves, reaching all the way to the dark line of trees in the distance. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had climbed much higher than I realized. Not physically. In some other way I couldn't describe. I rested one hand against the railing. The metal had grown colder. A faint draft passed through the opening behind me, carrying the dry smell of old grain that had long since disappeared from the building. Then someone spoke. "Thank you." The voice was calm, quiet enough that I almost mistook it for my own thoughts. It came from somewhere above me, not below, not behind, above. "Thank you for climbing high enough to be seen." Every muscle in my body tightened. The words weren't threatening. If anything, they sounded grateful. That made them far more unsettling. I looked toward the ceiling. Broken beams crossed the darkness overhead. Nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place. "Who's there?" I asked. My voice returned in a soft echo. No answer followed. Only silence. I waited. The chains had stopped moving. The drifting dust seemed frozen inside the moonlight. Even my breathing felt too loud. I thought about calling again. Instead, I remembered something my father used to say whenever we hiked the hills together. If a place refuses to answer twice, don't ask a third time. At the time, I thought he was talking about getting lost. Now I wasn't so sure. I turned toward the stairs. The polished footprints had disappeared. Only ordinary dust remained across the floor. For a long moment, I wondered whether I had imagined them. Then I noticed my own footprints. They ended halfway across the platform. Beyond them, there were none, as though I had somehow reached the railing without taking the last several steps. A quiet unease settled over me. I didn't stop to understand it. I walked carefully back toward the stairwell. Each step downward felt heavier than the last. When I reached the main floor, the doorway stood exactly where I'd left it, open to the moonlit fields outside. Relief washed over me. I crossed the building toward the exit. One more step, then another. My hand reached for the weathered metal door. Before my fingers touched it, the door swung shut, slowly, without a sound. The latch settled into place with one gentle click. From somewhere above, where the moonlight no longer reached, a quiet voice whispered, "You're visible now." The road through Ash Creek County was never meant for late-night travelers. At least, that's what the old mechanic in town used to say whenever someone mentioned taking the backroads after dark. He always smiled when he said it, as if he expected people to laugh along with him. I usually did. On the last Friday in November, I remembered those words far too late. The harvest was over, and the fields on both sides of the road lay bare beneath a clear sky. Frost had begun gathering along the fence posts, giving them a pale silver edge whenever my headlights swept across them. I hadn't passed another vehicle for nearly an hour. I wasn't in a hurry. The quiet suited me. Driving alone had always helped me think. My mother believed everyone needed a place where their thoughts could catch up with them. For me, it had always been long roads and empty country. The heater filled the cab with gentle warmth. The dashboard clock read 10:42. Without warning, the truck gave a small shudder. The engine coughed once. Then it went silent. I coasted onto the gravel shoulder and let the truck roll to a stop. When I stepped outside, cool night air wrapped around me. It carried the sharp scent of motor oil, and I immediately saw a thin stream of dark liquid beneath the front of the truck. I sighed. Old trucks always seem to choose the worst places to complain. I lifted the hood. Nothing looked obviously wrong. Steam wasn't rising. No belts had snapped. Everything appeared exactly as it should. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. Behind me, the radio crackled. That caught my attention. The truck wasn't running. The key wasn't even in the ignition anymore. Slowly, I lowered the hood. The radio grew clearer. Static faded away. A calm voice filled the empty road. Local conditions remained quiet tonight. I frowned. There hadn't been a station on this stretch of highway for miles. The announcer continued speaking in the same steady tone. A vehicle is currently stopped near mile marker 32. I looked around. The only vehicle was mine. The field stretched into darkness on both sides, empty beneath the stars. The driver has exited to inspect the engine. A chill settled across my shoulders. The voice never sounded excited. It simply described events. They're reporting exactly what I'm doing. I whispered. The announcer continued. The driver is now looking toward the western field. I hadn't meant to, yet my eyes turned toward the field, almost on their own. Nothing waited there. Only rows of harvested ground disappearing into the distance. I reached into the cab and turned the radio off. The voice continued. Same volume, same calm rhythm. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It seemed to exist inside the truck itself. The driver believes there is no one nearby. I stepped backward. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. The voice paused. Then it spoke again. The driver should remain inside the vehicle. For a moment, I considered laughing. Stress could do strange things. Long drives, little sleep, too much coffee. Every explanation sounded reasonable until the announcer spoke once more. Do not step away from the truck. I had already taken 3 steps. A long silence followed. Then, I'm sorry. The words were almost gentle. Something tapped against the passenger side window. Once, I froze. A few seconds later, another tap, this time on the rear window. Not loud, not forceful, just enough to be noticed. I turned slowly. No one stood there. The glass reflected only the empty road and the dark outline of my truck. A third tap came from the driver's window. One. Only one. It reminded me of a neighbor who used to knock politely before entering our house when I was a child. 3 careful knocks, always spaced apart. My mother would smile before opening the door, because she already knew who had arrived. This felt nothing like that. The tapping traveled around the truck. Passenger side, rear window, windshield, back again. Never hurried, never repeated on the same piece of glass twice. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. The announcer returned. The visitor has reached the vehicle. I closed my eyes for a moment. Every part of me wanted to look across the fields, to search for whoever or whatever might be circling the truck. Instead, I remembered something my father once told me after we watched deer disappear into a forest. Not everything asked to be seen. I stayed exactly where I was. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed felt strangely complete. After several long moments, I opened the driver's door and climbed inside. The radio had gone dark. I turned the key. The engine started immediately, as though nothing had ever been wrong. No warning lights. No strange sounds. I drove until the eastern sky began turning gray. The first morning birds welcomed the sunrise, and a familiar world slowly returned. Farmhouses appeared along the road. A school bus rolled through a nearby intersection. Everything felt ordinary again. Later that afternoon, after catching up on sleep, I tried to find the station that had spoken to me. I searched every local frequency. Nothing. When I visited a small radio shop a week later, the owner looked through decades of broadcast records for that county. No station had ever transmitted from that road. Not now, not in the past. Sometimes on quiet nights, I still think about the apology the announcer gave before the tapping began. I never learned who the visitor was, and after hearing that voice, I no longer regret choosing not to look outside my windows. The old red barn stood at the edge of a forgotten pasture a few miles outside Briar Hollow. I found it on an afternoon that had slipped quietly into evening, late enough for the sky to lose its color, but too early for the stars to appear. Thin clouds drifted overhead, and the last light settled across the weathered boards until the whole building seemed painted in fading gold. No houses stood nearby, no tractors, no fences in good repair. Only the barn, surrounded by tall grass that reached almost my knees. I had stopped because someone at a gas station mentioned it in passing. Funny thing, the man had said, while counting my change, "Birds won't go near that place." He laughed after saying it, but the laugh ended before the smile did. As I walked closer, I noticed something strange. The smell of dried hay filled the air. It was warm and familiar, reminding me of the county fair my parents took me to every summer when I was little. My sister and I used to disappear into the petting barns, convinced every animal wanted to be our friend. That scent always carried happy memories. Until that evening, with every step toward the open barn doors, the smell faded, not gradually. It simply became weaker and weaker, as though someone were quietly turning it down. By the time I reached the entrance, it was completely gone. The air had no scent at all. I stopped beneath the wide doorway. The inside of a barn rested in deep gray light. Wooden beams crossed overhead like the ribs of an old ship. Loose ropes hung from rusted hooks, and empty stalls lined both sides of the floor. The place should have echoed with small sounds. A mouse, a loose board, wind slipping through broken planks. Instead, nothing. The silence felt complete. I stepped inside. The floorboards answered with a soft creak beneath my boots. Dust floated lazily through the fading light coming from narrow gaps in the walls. Then I looked up. Bird nests. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Every beam held another carefully woven nest. Some were small enough for sparrows. Others belonged to larger birds I couldn't name. Together, they covered nearly every corner of the ceiling. Not one held a bird. Not one held an egg. Each nest contained the same thing. A single silver feather. They caught the evening light with a faint shine that didn't seem natural. They weren't bright enough to glow, yet they reflected far more light than they should have. I walked beneath them slowly. Every nest, one feather, always one. I reached toward the nearest nest, but stopped before touching it. Something about those feathers felt important. Like removing one would disturb a balance I couldn't understand. A memory came back to me. Years ago, my grandmother found a robin's nest that had fallen from a tree after a storm. I wanted to bring it home. She gently shook her head. Some things, she told me, are left where they belong, even after they're empty. I smiled at the memory. It faded almost immediately. A quiet voice drifted through the barn. "You're late." I turned. A child stood near the far wall. He couldn't have been older than 8. He wore faded overalls and muddy boots, the sort of clothes that looked ordinary enough for a farm, though something about him felt older than they should have been. His hands rested calmly at his sides. His expression held no fear, only recognition. "I didn't hear you come in," I said. "I was already here." His answer came so naturally that I almost accepted it without thinking. The boy looked toward the ceiling. "They've all gone." I followed his gaze to the nests. "Where?" He shrugged. "They left after the first visit." I frowned. "The first visit?" His eyes met mine again. "You don't remember?" A cool feeling settled in my chest. I've never been here before. For the first time, the boy looked confused. He tilted his head slightly, studying me the way someone studies an old photograph. "You always say that." The words landed harder than I expected. There wasn't anger in his voice. No accusation. Just quiet certainty. I searched my memory. Family trips. School outings. Wrong turns on old roads. Nothing. No barn. No silver feathers. No child. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else." He smiled softly. "No." Then he looked past me toward the open doorway. "They're almost back." I turned immediately. The pasture outside remained empty. Tall grass moved gently beneath the evening breeze. Nothing crossed the field. When I looked back, the boy was gone. The barn stood exactly as it had before. Empty stalls. Dust drifting through the fading light. Hundreds of silent nests overhead. I hurried toward the doorway, my footsteps echoing more loudly than before. Outside, the smell of dried hay returned all at once. Warm, familiar, comforting. I breathed deeply, without realizing how much I had missed it. The sky had grown darker while I was inside. The first stars had begun appearing overhead. I walked back toward my truck, without looking behind me. Halfway across the pasture, something caught my eye. One silver feather rested on the hood, perfectly still. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I picked it up carefully. It felt lighter than I expected, almost weightless. The surface reflected the evening sky like polished metal. I decided to leave it there. As I stepped away, a faint sound reached me from the barn. Not footsteps, not a voice. The gentle flutter of hundreds of wings, lifting together into the night. The corn was taller than it had any right to be. It was the middle of October, and harvest should have already begun across most of the county. Yet this field had been left untouched, stretching over the rolling hills in long rows that disappeared beneath a pale moon. The road beside it was little more than cracked asphalt, and the nearest farmhouse sat so far away that its porch light looked like a lonely star. I parked my truck beside an old wooden gate. I had been there once before, not exactly there, but close enough that the place stirred a feeling I couldn't explain. Ever since finding the strange newspaper outside Miller's corn and hearing my own voice beneath the farmhouse porch, I had started paying attention to roads that most people ignored. They seemed to have a habit of leading somewhere unexpected. The night carried a fresh scent of pine. That should have been impossible. There wasn't a single pine tree for miles, only fields. The smell drifted by once, then disappeared, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it. I slipped through the gate and followed the narrow path between the rows. The moonlight reached only the tops of the stalks, leaving the ground below wrapped in gentle darkness. Dry leaves brushed against my sleeves as I walked, making a faint rustling that blended with my breathing. For a while, nothing happened. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe I was becoming too willing to believe every lonely place held a mystery. Then I heard another footstep. It landed just after mine. I stopped. The sound came one step later. Soft, measured, not an echo. It continued ahead for another pace before fading. I listened carefully. Nothing. I started walking again, my boots pressed into the loose soil. A second pair of footsteps answered from somewhere beyond the next row, matching my pace, one after another, not hurried, not slow, simply keeping time with me. I told myself there had to be another person crossing the field, a farmer, someone taking a shortcut. Yet I never heard stalks breaking or leaves snapping under heavy movement, only footsteps, perfectly placed. I cleared my throat. Hello. The word drifted into the rows and vanished. No answer came. The footsteps continued. My father once told me that if you couldn't see who was walking beside you, it was better to let them keep their distance. I had never asked where he'd learned that. At the time, it sounded like another one of those quiet country sayings that older people carried around without explanation. Now it felt less like advice, more like a warning. I kept moving. The path curved gently through the field. The unseen traveler stayed with me. Every time I slowed, the other steps remained steady. Every time I paused, they continued for 1, 2, 3 more strides before stopping, as though whoever made them didn't notice I had stopped until a few moments later. A cool breeze passed through the corn. The leaves whispered against one another. Then everything settled again. I looked across the next row. Nothing, only straight lines of stalks reaching toward the sky. I told myself not to become foolish. If someone was there, they would appear eventually. If no one was there, then there was nothing to find. I took another step. The answering footstep came closer than before, not across another row, just beyond the one beside me, close enough that I could almost judge where a shoulder might have been. The smell of pine returned, stronger now. It carried a faint memory of camping trips with my parents when I was young. My mother always insisted on bringing extra blankets, even in the middle of summer. She believed every good memory deserved to be comfortable. I wish that memory had stayed warm. The footsteps stopped. For several long moments, the field became completely quiet. Then, a section of corn several yards ahead bent gently outward, not from the wind. The stalks leaned away from something passing between them. The movement traveled slowly, deliberately, drawing nearer. One row, then the next. No shape appeared, only the careful parting of the plants. I couldn't make myself move. The bending stalks reached the row beside mine. Another few seconds. Then they entered my row. The corn leaned away on both sides, creating a narrow passage where nothing could be seen. The space moved toward me, closer, closer, until it stopped beside my left shoulder. I stared into the empty place where the stalks remained pressed outward. Nothing stood there, nothing that my eyes could understand. Yet the corn stayed bent as though someone had chosen to stand quietly at my side. I became aware of my own breathing. Slow, careful, the field waited with me. I thought about turning my head. I didn't. Some instinct arrived too quietly to argue with. Instead, I looked forward. The moon hung above the far end of the field, bright enough to show the path leading back toward the gate. Without haste, I began walking. After 3 steps, the corn beside me straightened. The unseen space no longer moved with me. I reached the gate without looking back. The truck started on the first turn of the key. As I pulled onto the empty road, the scent of pine finally disappeared. Miles later, I stopped at a crossroads to settle my thoughts. The windows had begun to fog lightly from the warmth inside the cab. I wiped a clear circle across the glass. There, written from the outside in faint lines across the mist, was a single word. Again. The train left the station just before 11 on a cold November night. I chose it because I wanted the slower route home. Most people preferred the highway, but there was something comforting about watching quiet towns drift past a train window while the rest of the world hurried somewhere else. My father had loved trains. Whenever we traveled together, he always insisted on sitting beside the window, saying every journey deserved a good view, even after dark. I found my ticket. Seat 11. The carriage was nearly empty. Only a handful of passengers sat scattered throughout the cabin, each keeping to themselves beneath the warm yellow lights. The seats were covered in faded fabric, and the faint smell of old cloth lingered in the air, mixed with the clean scent of polished wood from the narrow tables between the seats. The train pulled away with a gentle lurch. Its steady rhythm settled into the background until it felt almost like breathing. Outside, the countryside rolled past in long stretches of open farmland. Fence posts flashed by in neat rows, disappearing into the darkness behind us. Every now and then, a lonely farmhouse window glowed in the distance before fading from sight. I rested my forehead lightly against the cool glass. Watching empty fields at night has always calmed me. The darkness never felt empty, only unfinished. For nearly half an hour, nothing unusual happened. I read a few pages from an old paperback I had brought along, sipped lukewarm tea from a paper cup, listened to the quiet murmur of wheels beneath the carriage. Then I glanced outside again. The stars looked different. At first, I thought clouds had drifted across the sky, but there weren't any clouds. The familiar patterns I had known since childhood were gone. In their place were new arrangements, lines and clusters that seemed almost organized, though not in any way I recognized. I blinked, looked away, then back again. The stars had shifted once more. Not quickly, just enough that I couldn't convince myself I had imagined it. I smiled to myself, though it felt uncertain. Long nights can play tricks on tired eyes. That explanation stayed with me until the train rounded a gentle curve. The same windmill appeared outside. I remembered it because one blade was missing. We passed it. Several minutes later, there was again. Same broken blade. Same leaning fence. Same lonely field stretching behind it. I sat up straighter. Perhaps there were 2 similar farms. The countryside often repeated itself. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. An elderly man sitting across the aisle looked up from his newspaper. You noticed it too. His voice was quiet, as though he didn't want to disturb the train. I nodded. The windmill? He folded the newspaper carefully. No, the field. I frowned. What about it? He looked toward the window, but didn't seem interested in the view anymore. We'd been passing the same one for hours. I checked my watch. Only 40 minutes had passed since we left the station. That can't be right. He gave a small shrug. I've been saying that since yesterday. For a moment, I waited for him to smile. He never did. The carriage settled back into silence. I tried reading again. The words refused to stay in place. Every few minutes my eyes wandered toward the window. The same field. Again, the same weathered fence. Again, the same lonely windmill turning one slow circle before disappearing behind us. Again, I decided to walk. Moving around usually helped clear my thoughts. The next carriage was almost empty. A young woman slept beside the window with headphones resting around her neck. Farther ahead, a conductor quietly punched tickets for 2 passengers I hadn't noticed before. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. When he reached me, I handed over my ticket. He studied it for a moment. Seat 11. I nodded. He hesitated, then clipped the ticket without another word. As I turned away, I heard him whisper something to himself. I couldn't make out the words. Back in my seat, I noticed the elderly man was gone. His newspaper remained neatly folded on the table. No one had seen him leave. I looked around the carriage. Every seat stayed exactly as before, only it was empty now. Outside, dawn had begun painting the eastern sky with soft gray light. The stars faded one by one. The strange patterns disappeared with them. Fields slowly gave way to small towns, telephone poles, roads. The familiar world returned. The train eased into the station with barely a sound. Passengers gathered their bags and stepped onto the platform. I followed them. The morning air felt crisp against my face. As I reached the exit, the conductor called after me. "Excuse me." I turned. He held my ticket between 2 fingers. "I believe this belongs to you." I looked down. The number printed across it had faded almost completely. Only one word remained clear. 11. "I don't understand," I said. He studied me with quiet confusion. "Neither do I." He glanced toward the passenger list in his hand. "I've checked it 3 times. His voice became almost a whisper. "There hasn't been a seat 11 on this train for nearly 20 years. I looked back toward the carriage. The window where I had spent the night reflected the pale morning sky. Every seat inside was empty, exactly where mine should have been. There was only a smooth section of wall, as though no seat had ever existed at all. The water tower stood alone beyond the edge of Fairview County, where the roads became narrow and the fields seemed to stretch forever. It was the first clear night after a week of rain. The ground still held the day's moisture, and every step across the grass released a clean scent of fresh leaves and damp soil. The sky had opened completely, revealing more stars than I usually noticed from town. Their light was faint, but was enough to outline the tower against the darkness. I had come because of an old notebook. A retired farmer had mentioned it while we shared coffee in a small cafe that barely appeared on maps. He told me someone had hidden it beneath the water tower years ago. Most people dismiss the story, but he never smiled while telling it. "Don't stay after midnight," he said before I left. He never explained why. By the time I reached the tower, the moon had climbed high enough to cast long silver light across the empty fields. That was when I noticed the shadow. The tower's shadow stretched much farther than it should have. It reached across the grass, crossed the road, and continued into another field where no moonlight should have allowed it to exist. I stopped walking. I looked at the moon, then back at the shadow. Nothing made sense. It remained perfectly straight, as though pointing towards something waiting in the distance. I told myself there had to be an angle I wasn't seeing, some trick of the landscape. Still, I found myself following it. The grass brushed quietly against my boots until I reached the base of the tower. For steel legs disappeared into the darkness overhead. The ladder climbed almost all the way to the tank, vanishing into the pale glow above. I rested one hand against one of the support beams. The steel felt colder than the night air. A gentle vibration traveled through it, not strong enough to shake my hand, just enough to make me wonder if water was moving somewhere high above. I listened carefully. No pumps, no machinery, nothing that should have caused a movement. The vibration continued anyway. My flashlight found an old maintenance box bolted to one of the legs. Its door had fallen away years earlier. Inside rested only dust, a broken wrench, and a weathered notebook. The cover had almost faded white. I opened it carefully. The first pages contained rough sketches of the surrounding farmland. Fence lines, roads, old barns. Nothing unusual. Then the drawings changed. Each page showed circles pressed into crops from a bird's eye view. Above every circle floated small lights. Not airplanes, not helicopters. Just smooth shapes descending toward the fields without wings or propellers. The artist had drawn them with remarkable care. Each page included dates stretching back decades. Some entries were separated by only weeks, others by several years. The handwriting grew shakier near the end. Short notes appeared beneath the sketches. They return when the fields are quiet. Another page. Do not wave. Then, they remember faces. A breeze stirred the pages. I almost closed the notebook. Instead, I turned to the last drawing. My hand became still. The final page showed a man standing beneath this very water tower. His jacket matched mine. The old baseball cap I had worn all evening rested on his head. Even the flashlight hung from his right hand, exactly as I held mine. The face wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was me. In the corner of the page, someone had written a date, 20 years earlier. I counted twice, then a third time. The numbers never changed. I wasn't even old enough to have been there. A quiet unease settled over me. I searched every earlier page, hoping to find another explanation. Nothing. Only careful drawings, patient handwriting, and the same warning repeated near the back. They always come back. My grandfather used to keep journals about the weather. Every evening after supper, he'd write a few lines about the wind, the clouds, or how much rain had fallen that day. He believed that writing things down made the world easier to understand. Looking at that notebook, I wasn't sure I agreed anymore. Some things only become stranger once they're written. I closed the cover. The vibration in the steel had stopped. The fields around me rested in complete silence. Then I noticed something. The long shadow cast by the tower was gone. The moon hadn't moved enough for that, yet the grass around me held no shadow at all. I slowly looked upward. The tower remained exactly where it had been. Tall, silent, unmoving. But high above, near the edge of the tank, a pale blue light drifted into view. It wasn't bright, only soft enough to outline the railing before slipping quietly to the opposite side. Then it disappeared. I stood there for what felt like several minutes. Nothing returned. No voices. No movement. Only the night. I tucked the notebook beneath my arm and walked back toward the road. Halfway to my truck, I looked down. Fresh footprints crossed the damp ground beside mine. They hadn't been there when I arrived. Each print shimmered faintly in the moonlight, smooth as polished glass before slowly fading into ordinary earth. I reached the truck without stopping. The notebook rested on the passenger seat all the way home. I never opened it again. Sometimes, though, I wonder about the last page. Not because it showed me, because when I remember it now, I'm certain there was someone standing just behind my shoulder. And I don't remember seeing that the first time. The orchard waited at the end of a narrow dirt road that most maps no longer bother to name. It was late October, only a few nights before the first hard frost. The moon hung low above the hills, bright enough to paint the old apple trees in pale silver. Their branches stretched across the field like quiet hands, heavy with fruit that should have fallen weeks earlier. No one on the land anymore. At least, that was what the woman at the general store had told me. People used to pick apples there every autumn, she said while placing my change on the counter. Then one year they stopped. She didn't explain why. Neither did I ask. By the time I arrived, the road had become little more than 2 tire tracks winding through tall grass. My headlights swept across rows of aging trees before coming to rest on a small clearing near the center of the orchard. It felt peaceful, the kind of place where time had simply slowed down. I pitched my small tent beneath one of the oldest trees. its trunk thick enough that two people could barely reach around it. Fallen apples covered the ground, untouched by birds or animals. The air carried the sweet smell of ripe fruit. Too sweet. The season had already turned cold. Most orchards would have smelled of dry leaves by then. This one felt as though autumn had refused to move on. I boiled water over a small camping stove and watched the steam disappear into the cool night. My mother always packed warm tea whenever we traveled together. She believed a hot drink could make even unfamiliar places feel welcoming. That thought stayed with me while I sat outside the tent, listening to the quiet. There was no wind, no distant traffic, only the occasional rustle of leaves somewhere deeper among the trees. Hours passed gently. The moon climbed higher. When I finally stood to stretch my legs, something caught my attention near the edge of clearing. The fallen leaves had shifted, not everywhere, only in one place. They formed a perfect circle around my tent. I frowned. I hadn't noticed it before. The ring wasn't large, perhaps 15 feet across. Every leaf outside the circle rested naturally. Inside it, the ground remained almost bare, as though someone had carefully brushed the leaves away without disturbing the grass beneath. I walked around the edge. The shape stayed perfectly even. No footprints crossed it. No marks showed where tools had scraped the earth. It simply existed. I knelt to touch the ground. The soil felt ordinary, dry, firm. Nothing explained the careful pattern surrounding me. I stood again. The sweet scent of apples drifted by once more, followed by something I couldn't quite place. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar enough to make me pause. The orchard had become quieter. The gentle rustling I had heard earlier was gone. Every tree stood motionless beneath the moonlight. Then I noticed one branch. It belonged to the old tree beside my tent. The branch bent slightly downward, not under its own weight, as though something had settled upon it. I looked carefully. Nothing was visible. The leaves remained perfectly still, yet the branch stayed lowered. My eyes followed its length until they reached the empty space above me. I had the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't the only one beneath that tree. Not fear. Not yet. Only awareness. The kind you feel when entering a room and realizing someone else is already there. I stepped away from the trunk. The branch slowly lifted back into place. I stopped. It lowered again. I tried once more. One step backward. The branch rose. One step forward. It dipped gently toward me. My breathing became quieter. I remembered something my father had told me during a fishing trip many years ago. If the birds refuse a tree, pay attention. I looked around. Not a single bird rested among the branches. Not one nest. Not one feather. Only apples hanging quietly beneath the moon. The feeling lingered until sometime after midnight. I sat inside the tent with the entrance partly unzipped, watching the clearing to the narrow opening. Nothing moved. The circle of bare ground remained exactly as before. Time passed slowly. Eventually, without realizing it, I drifted into a light sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the sky had begun turning pale with the first hint of dawn. The orchard looked different, not brighter, emptier. The sweetness in the air had disappeared. The branches no longer seemed heavy. Even the perfect circle around my tent had faded beneath a fresh layer of fallen leaves, as though it had never existed. I stepped outside. The old tree stood quietly above me. Every branch rested exactly where it should. For several minutes, I packed my camping gear in silence. Nothing unusual happened. No strange sounds. No movement. Only morning settling gently across the orchard. As I placed the last bag into the truck, I found myself looking back one final time. Every tree appeared ordinary now. Weathered. Peaceful. Empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had left only moments before I woke. Not because I had seen it. Because the orchard felt as though it had been holding its breath all night and had finally exhaled. I rented the farmhouse because it was quiet. It's at several miles outside a town called Ash Hollow, surrounded by open fields that seemed to roll forever beneath the autumn sky. The owner told me the place had belonged to his grandparents, and that no one had lived there for nearly 15 years. The rent was low. The porch leaned a little. The windows rattled whenever the wind found them. None of that bothered me. After everything I had seen over the past few months, I had started believing that ordinary places were the safest ones. I was wrong. The first evening passed without anything unusual. I unpacked a few boxes, made coffee in the old kitchen, and watched the sunset spread across the endless corn beyond the backyard. The fields had already turned pale gold, waiting for the last harvest. They looked peaceful enough that I almost laughed at myself for expecting anything strange. The basement was different. A narrow wooden staircase led down into cool darkness beneath the house. The stone walls had been laid by hand many years ago, each one uneven beneath a thin layer of dust. The faint scent of rainwater lingered there, even though the weather had been dry for days. I carried a flashlight with me while checking the furnace. Near the far wall sat a single window, small, square, barely large enough for someone to crawl through. It looked directly toward the cornfield. That made no sense. The window was below ground level. Outside it, there should have been nothing except packed soil. Instead, I could see rows of corn stretching beneath the evening sky, perfectly clear. I stood there longer than I meant to. Eventually, I convinced myself that the basement had probably been built into the side of a gentle hill. It wasn't. I checked the next morning. The ground outside was completely flat. The window should have faced earth, not a field. I tried not to think about it. For the next few days, life settled into a quiet routine. Coffee before sunrise, long walks along the empty roads, reading beside the fireplace after dark. The house felt lonely, but not unfriendly, until midnight. The first knock came while I was halfway through a book. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced. I looked toward the front door. Nothing. A few moments later, 3 more. This time I realized the sound hadn't come from upstairs. It had come from below. The basement. I carried my flashlight down the steps. The basement stood exactly as before. The furnace remained silent. Dust rested undisturbed across the floor. Then 3 gentle knocks. They came from the window. I stared at the glass. Outside, the moonlight rested across endless rows of corn. No person stood there. No ladder. No way for anyone to reach a window that should have been underground. The knocking stopped. I waited another minute. Nothing happened. I went back upstairs. The next night, it returned. Always at midnight. Always 3 careful taps. Never louder. Never softer. For a week, I ignored it. By the second week, I found myself waiting for it. Strange how quickly people become used to impossible things. My grandmother used to say that habits were stronger than fear. She believed people could grow comfortable with almost anything if it happened often enough. I hated realizing she was right. One rainy evening, I decided to measure the window. I walked outside before sunset, carrying a tape measure. The spot where the basement window should have been laid beneath 2 feet of solid ground. There was no opening, only grass. I stood there until the rain soaked through my jacket. When I returned inside, the basement window still looked out across the corn. On the 12th night, I answered. The clock had barely reached midnight when a familiar knocking began. 0.3 taps. I walked downstairs without the flashlight this time. Moonlight spilling through the impossible window gave the basement enough light to see. The corn outside moved gently, not from wind, just a slow ripple passing between the rows. The knocking came again. I stepped closer. My reflection floated faintly across the glass. Beyond it, only the field. I rested my hand against the window. The glass felt warmer than my skin. Before I could lose my nerve, I whispered, "Come in." Nothing happened. For several long moments, the basement remained perfectly quiet. Then the knocking stopped. For good. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. A strange feeling of relief settled over me. Perhaps speaking had broken whatever strange pattern had begun. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, the basement was silent. The night after that, silent. Another week passed. No knocking. Life returned to normal. Or at least, I believed it had. Until one evening, while carrying laundry downstairs, I noticed something different. The basement window no longer showed the cornfield. Now, it showed my backyard. Exactly as it should. I smiled. For the first time since moving in, everything made sense. Then I looked toward the clothesline outside. Someone stood beside it, not moving, not waving, just standing with their back turned toward the house. The figure wore the same jacket I had hanging by the front door, the same boots I was wearing, the same posture I recognized from every mirror. Slowly, the figure lifted one hand, not to wave, to knock. 3 quiet taps echoed from somewhere behind me. I didn't turn around. I already knew they hadn't come from the window anymore. The gas station wasn't on any map I owned. I had been driving west of the backroads of Pine Ridge County in early December, following a highway that seemed to grow narrower with every passing mile. Snow had fallen the night before, leaving thin white patches across the empty fields. The sky was clear now, and the last light of the afternoon rested on the distant hills like fading gold. My fuel gauge had been sitting just above empty for longer than I liked. I kept telling myself the next town couldn't be far away. Instead, the road curved around a small rise, and there it was, one gas pump, a single-story building with weathered white walls, an old sign that simply read gas. No town, no houses, no side roads, just the station standing alone beside the highway. I pulled in without giving it much thought. The tires crunched softly over loose gravel as I stopped beside the pump. The cold air carried the clean scent of fresh gasoline, but underneath it drifted another fragrance. Wildflowers, sweet and fresh. I looked around in quiet surprise. The ground was frozen. Nothing should have been blooming, yet the smell remained, gentle enough to feel almost familiar. It reminded me of the little garden behind my mother's kitchen window. Every spring she planted flowers, simply because she liked seeing color while she washed the dishes. She used to say that ordinary beauty deserved as much attention as extraordinary things. Standing beside that lonely station, I wished I had been thinking about her garden instead. The bell above the door gave a soft ring as I stepped inside. The store was small, a few shelves of canned food, dusty postcards, a humming refrigerator filled with bottles of soda. Behind the counter stood an older man wearing a faded blue jacket. He smiled before I spoke. "I wonder when you come back." The words caught me off guard. "I'm sorry." He tilted his head. "You always look confused the first time." I laughed politely. "I think you mistaken me for someone else." "I never do." His answer wasn't unfriendly, just certain. He slid a receipt book across the counter while I reached for my wallet. "You still take your coffee black?" I stared at him. "I've never been here." His smile faded only slightly. "That's what you said before." A quiet feeling settled into the room. Not panic, only the uncomfortable sense that I had entered a conversation already in progress. I paid for the fuel without asking another question. The old register rang once. The sound lingered longer than it should have. While the pump slowly filled the tank, I wandered toward the front window. The parking lot remained empty. No other cars. No tire tracks except my own. The station stood alone in every direction. When the pump clicked to a stop, I carried the nozzle back into place and glanced toward the security camera mounted beneath the awning. Its tiny screen sat inside above the counter. Without really thinking, I looked at it. The monitor showed the parking lot exactly as it was. The pump, the road, the empty fields. But there was no truck, no person standing beside the pump. The gravel looked untouched. I stepped closer. The camera angle included the exact place where I had been standing only moments earlier. Nothing. The screen showed an empty station. I turned toward the front window. My truck sat exactly where I had left it. I could see it with my own eyes. I looked back at the monitor. Still empty. The cashier noticed where I was looking. It doesn't always remember visitors. His voice remained calm. "As long as you remember yourself." I wanted to ask what that meant. Instead, I picked up the receipt lying beside the register. Perhaps reading something ordinary would steady my thoughts. The paper felt warm, freshly printed. Across the top appeared today's purchase. Fuel, 1 coffee. I hadn't bought coffee. Beneath that, a weather forecast. Tomorrow, clear skies until 9:14 p.m. Lights expected over the western fields. Avoid stopping. I frowned. This isn't a weather report. The cashier nodded. "No, It's tomorrow's. I looked at the date. It hadn't changed, only the forecast. I folded the receipt slowly. This isn't funny. I wasn't trying to be. The room became very quiet. Outside, the sun had almost disappeared below the hills. Long shadows stretched across the empty highway. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly wanted to leave as quickly as possible. I thanked the cashier out of habit. He gave a small wave. Drive carefully. I opened the door. The bell rang again. Cool evening air greeted me. The sweet smell of wildflowers had vanished, replaced by the clean bite of approaching winter. I climbed into the truck and started the engine. Before pulling away, I looked back toward the station. The cashier still stood behind the counter, watching, not waving anymore, just watching. I drove until darkness settled over the countryside. The receipt rested on the passenger seat beside me. The next evening, curiosity got the better of me. At exactly 9:14, I looked west across an open field while driving home. 3 pale blue lights drifted silently above the harvested rows. They remained there for less than a minute before rising into the stars. I never found that gas station again. I've driven that highway several times since. The road is still there. The frozen fields are still there. But where the station once stood, there's only an empty patch of ground that no security camera could have forgotten. Black Creek crossed the county like a quiet line no one talked about. It wasn't wide, just deep enough that the water reflected the sky with unusual clarity. An old wooden bridge stretched across it, built decades before I was born. The paint had long since disappeared from its railings, leaving weathered boards that groaned whenever a car passed over them. I arrived just after sunset, in the middle of November. The last traces of daylight were fading behind the hills, and the first stars had begun appearing overhead. The creek moved so slowly that its surface looked almost perfectly still. A cool breeze carried the fresh scent of moss mixed with slow-moving water, the kind of smell that always reminded me of fishing trips with my father. We rarely caught anything. He said that wasn't the point. Sometimes people simply needed a quiet place to sit together. I parked beside the bridge and walked toward the center. The boards answered each step with a soft creak. Below me, the dark water reflected the evening sky so clearly that it felt less like a creek and more like another world lying beneath the bridge. I rested my hands on the railing. The stars above looked familiar. The ones below did not. Their patterns stretched across the water in strange arrangements that shifted whenever the current moved, forming shapes I couldn't recognize before drifting apart again. I looked up. The ordinary constellations remained exactly where they belonged. I looked down again. The unfamiliar stars continued shining beneath the surface. I told myself it had to be a trick of reflection. Perhaps branches along the bank were bending the light. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it was the only one I had. A voice echoed somewhere downstream. Hello. It was faint, almost carried away by the breeze. Without thinking, I answered, Hello. The reply came back immediately. Not my voice. Someone else's. Older. Calmer. Good evening. I stood very still. The bridge stretched empty in both directions. No footsteps. No vehicles. No one fishing along the banks. I leaned over the railing. Is someone there? The creek accepted my words. A moment later, it returned them. Again, not in my voice. This time it sounded like a young woman. I'm already here. The echo faded into silence. A cool feeling settled into my chest. Not fear, only confusion. I had spent enough time outdoors to know how echoes worked. They repeated what you gave them. They didn't answer questions. I tried once more. Who are you? The creek carried the words away. When they returned, the voice belonged to a child. Who are you? The answer wasn't mocking. It sounded genuinely curious. The hairs along my arms lifted. I stepped back from the railing and laughed quietly to myself. Lack of sleep, long drives, too many lonely places. There had to be a simple reason. I remained on the bridge anyway. The water below continued reflecting its unfamiliar stars. The current moved slowly enough that I could almost imagine the sky beneath me breathing. My grandmother once told me that water remembers every face that leans over it. She believed rivers carried little pieces of people long after they walked away. I smiled at the memory. She had a saying for everything. Most of them sounded harmless until nights like this. A fish broke the surface somewhere downstream. The ripples spread gently across the creek. Every strange star vanished for a heartbeat. When the water became smooth again, they had returned, exactly where they had been. I looked toward my reflection. It floated quietly beneath the bridge. Tired eyes, dark jacket, baseball cap, nothing unusual. I raised one hand. My reflection raised its hand. I lowered it. So did the reflection. For a moment, I felt embarrassed by how nervous I had become. Then I took one step backward. My reflection didn't. It remained at the railing, still looking down. Still, I blinked. Surely I had imagined it. The reflection slowly lifted its head. Now it looked directly at me. I hadn't moved. Neither had it. Except it smiled. Not a wide smile. Just enough to soften its face. Then it raised one hand. A slow wave. I stood frozen. The creek remained perfectly quiet. No breeze. No birds. Only that impossible reflection waiting below. After several long seconds, it lowered its hand, turned away from the railing, and began walking downstream across the surface of the water. Not sinking, not splashing, simply walking until darkness slowly swallowed it. I looked over both sides of the bridge. Nothing. The water reflected only the ordinary stars again. My own face had returned. Carefully, I stepped away from the railing. The wooden boards creaked beneath my boots. This time, no echo answered. I reached my truck just as the first real chill of the night settled across the valley. The engine started without trouble. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The bridge stood empty beneath the moon. Or so I thought, just before the road curved out of sight. I noticed a lone figure standing at the center of the bridge, hands resting on the railing, watching the water below. It wore my jacket, my cap, and it never once looked up to watch me leave. The greenhouse stood behind an old estate at the edge of Willow Ridge, hidden beneath towering hedges that had long since grown wild. I found on a mild night in early spring, when the days had begun to grow longer, but the evenings still carried a lingering chill. A narrow stone path led through the overgrown garden, disappearing beneath vines before ending at the weathered glass building. Most of the estate had fallen into ruin. The greenhouse had not. Moonlight rested across every pane, making the glass shimmer softly against the darkness. From a distance, it almost looked alive. I pushed open the iron frame door. Its hinges gave a quiet sigh. Warm air greeted me at once, carrying the rich smell of growing plants mixed with fresh soil. The sudden change in temperature fogged my glasses for a moment, and I stood still until my vision cleared. Rows of flowers stretched from one end of the greenhouse to the other. White lilies, deep red roses, lavender, plants I recognized beside others I had never seen before. Every one of them looked perfectly healthy. That didn't seem possible. No one had cared for this place in years. Water still rested in narrow channels beneath the benches, reflecting the moonlight that poured through the glass ceiling. Tiny drops clung to the leaves like scattered pearls. The quiet felt peaceful, almost welcoming. My mother always believed greenhouses carried a different kind of silence. Whenever she visited one, she lowered her voice without realizing it, as though the flowers deserved their own kind of respect. I caught myself doing the same. I wandered slowly between the rows. The air was comfortably warm. The leaves brushed lightly against my sleeves whenever the path narrowed. Somewhere overhead, a small drop of water fell onto a broadleaf with the gentlest sound. Time seemed to slow. I almost forgot why I had come. Then I noticed the lilies. Every bloom faced the western wall. I smiled to myself. Perhaps they had grown toward the afternoon sun. It was ordinary, nothing more. A few steps later, I passed another row. The roses also faced west. So did the lavender. So did every flower in the greenhouse. None of them turned toward the moonlight pouring through the roof. They were all looking through the same wall of glass. I stopped walking. Very slowly, I looked toward the western side of the greenhouse. Nothing waited beyond it. Only an empty meadow stretching toward a distant line of trees. The flowers remained perfectly still. I continued along the path. The warmth that had seemed comforting only moments before now felt strangely close, as though the greenhouse itself were holding a quiet breath. I knelt beside a small blue flower, whose petals had almost completely opened. Its stem bent slightly, not toward me, toward the glass. The movement was so gentle I almost missed it. Then another flower shifted. Then another, one by one. Every blossom leaned just a little farther in the same direction. No breeze touched them. The leaves around my shoulders remained perfectly still. Only the flowers moved. I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me while working in her garden. If every flower turns together, she would pause there, smiling. Someone interesting has arrived. As a child, I always assumed she meant butterflies. Standing inside that greenhouse, I wasn't so certain anymore. A faint prickling ran across the back of my neck. Not fear, only the feeling that comes when you realize you're sharing a quiet place with something you hadn't noticed before. I walked toward the western wall. The flowers seemed to follow. Not quickly, not enough to be obvious, just enough that by the time I reached the glass, every bloom in the greenhouse faced directly toward the empty field outside. I placed my hand against the pane. It felt cool, far cooler than the warm air inside. Beyond the glass, moonlight rested across the grass without revealing anything unusual. No footprints, no animals, no movement. Then I noticed the first mark. A tiny print appeared on the outside of the glass, small enough to fit beneath the tip of my thumb. It glowed faintly, as though someone had touched the pane with light instead of a hand. A second appeared beside it, then another, and another. They spread quietly across the greenhouse wall, higher, lower, some at eye level, others almost reaching the roof. None of them showed the shape of a full hand, only fingertips, 5 delicate points pressed gently against the glass before lifting away. More appeared across the ceiling, along the doors, across every window. Hundreds of them, each one glowing softly for only a few seconds before fading. No sound accompanied them. No figure stood outside. Nothing disturbed the meadow beyond. The flowers never looked away. I found myself holding my breath. The greenhouse remained warm, peaceful, beautiful, yet every blossom seemed to be watching someone I couldn't see. After several long moments, the glowing prints stopped appearing. One by one, the old marks faded until only clear glass remained. The flowers slowly relaxed. Their stems settled. The room felt ordinary again. I stepped outside into the cool night. The meadow stretched empty beneath the stars. The greenhouse stood quietly behind me, every pane reflecting the moon. I walked halfway down the stone path before curiosity made me turn around one last time. The flowers were no longer facing the western wall. Every single one of them had turned toward the door through which I had just left. The Harvest Festival had been part of Briar's Crossing for as long as anyone could remember. Every October, families gathered in the town square beneath strings of warm lights. Children ran between hay bales stacked into little mazes. Farmers brought their finest pumpkins, fresh bread filled the market tables, and music drifted through the streets until long after sunset. I hadn't been back in nearly 12 years. Life has a quiet way of pulling people away from places that raise them. One season becomes another, and before you realize it, familiar roads begin to feel like memories instead of directions. When I arrived that evening, the festival looked exactly as I remembered. Smoke from small bonfires drifted gently through the cool air, carrying the comforting smell of burning wood. Laughter flowed across the square, while vendors packed apples into paper bags for children waiting patiently beside their parents. For the first hour, everything felt wonderfully ordinary. I almost believed the strange places I had visited over the past few months belonged to another life. My old school stood just beyond the church. The bakery still displayed the same faded wooden sign. Even the courthouse clock remained 5 minutes slow, just as it had been when I was a boy. Some things, I thought, never truly changed. Then they rang the closing bell. It echoed across the square once. Normally, the festival continued until nearly midnight. Instead, conversation stopped almost immediately. The musicians lowered their instruments. Vendors folded their tables without a word. Parents quietly gathered their children. Within minutes, the celebration dissolved into silence. No announcement, no explanation. Everyone simply left. I watched families disappear down empty streets with their heads lowered, as though they had practiced this routine many times before. A nearby shopkeeper noticed my confusion. "You should head home." "It's barely 8, I replied. He looked toward the fields beyond town. "I know." Then he locked his door and hurried away. Soon I found myself standing alone in the square. The bonfires still burned, their glowing embers sending ribbons of smoke into the darkening sky. The smell reminded me of evenings spent camping with my father, when we'd sit beside the fire after everyone else had gone to sleep. He used to stare into the flames for long stretches without speaking. When I finally asked what he was thinking about, he smiled. Sometimes silence tells you more than people do. That memory returned as I looked around the deserted streets. The silence here was saying something. I simply couldn't understand it. Then I noticed the sky. 3 pale blue lights floated above the western fields. They weren't bright enough to light the ground, only bright enough to be noticed. They moved together without sound, drifting slowly across the horizon before stopping over the distant corn. No fireworks, no aircraft, just 3 quiet lights hanging above the land. Every porch curtain facing the fields had been closed, every window darkened. It felt as though the entire town had chosen not to witness what happened next. The lights remained there for several long minutes. Then they rose, straight upward, growing smaller until they blended with the stars. Only then did I hear footsteps behind me. An elderly farmer stood near the empty fountain, his hands tucked into the pockets of an old brown coat. His face looked familiar. After a moment, I remembered him, Mr. Harlan. He had owned the farm next to my grandparents' place when I was young. He gave me a tired smile. "You stayed." I didn't know I was supposed to leave. "I know." His voice carried no judgment, only quiet understanding. Without another word, he reached into his coat and removed a small envelope. "I've been keeping this." He placed it gently into my hands. "For when you came back." The paper had yellowed with age. My name was written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside rested a single photograph. It had been taken during one of the harvest festivals many years earlier. Children stood laughing near the pumpkin display. Families filled the square. Bonfires burned in the background. Near the center, I saw myself, perhaps 8 years old, standing beside my father. I smiled without thinking. Then my eyes drifted toward the space just behind us. Someone else stood there. At first, I assumed it was another visitor. The longer I looked, the less certain I became. The figure was unusually tall. Its arms seemed a little too long. Its face, there wasn't enough detail to describe it. Only a smooth brightness where features should have been. No one else in the photograph appeared to notice it, not even my father. I looked up. "When was this taken?" Mr. Harlan studied the empty fields before answering. "The year they started remembering you." The words settled heavily between us. "I don't understand." "I know." He looked older somehow, more tired. "They've been visiting these fields longer than this town has been here." He paused, and every so often his eyes met mine. They choose someone who sees them. A cool breeze carried the last traces of smoke through the square. I looked back down at the photograph. This time, something else caught my attention. My father wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking directly at the tall figure behind us. His expression wasn't frightened. It was familiar, almost accepting. I opened my mouth to ask another question. Mr. Harlan was gone. The square stood empty once more. Only the quiet crackle of the dying bonfires remained. I folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. As I walked toward my truck, I glanced one final time at the western fields. The lights had vanished. The stars looked ordinary again. Yet deep inside, a feeling had begun to grow. Not that something had found me, but that something had recognized me from long before I ever learned to recognize it. The cabin overlooked Hollow Ridge from the highest point on the mountain. I rented it during the first week of December. hoping a few quiet days away from empty roads and abandoned farms might finally settle my thoughts. Snow had dusted the pine-covered slopes that morning, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already slipping behind the western peaks. The air was cold enough to leave little clouds with every breath, and the scent of cedar drifted from the cabin's old log walls. It felt like the sort of place where nothing unusual could happen. There were no neighboring houses, no power lines, no towns within sight, only mountains behind me, and far below, the broad patchwork of farmland stretching toward the horizon. The owner had left a handwritten note on the kitchen table, with a stack behind the cabin. Lock the door before dark. Enjoy the quiet. Simple advice. I smiled. After the months I had spent chasing impossible places, quiet sounded like exactly what I needed. The evening passed gently. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and watched its soft light dance across the walls. An old kettle sang quietly on the stove while snowflakes drifted past the windows outside. My father loved cabins like this. Whenever we traveled into the mountains, he always woke before sunrise just to sit on the porch with a mug of coffee. He used to say that high places help people remember how small their worries really were. I wished he had been right. After supper, I stepped onto the porch. The valley below had disappeared into darkness. Only a handful of distant farm lights remained, scattered like tiny stars across the land. I leaned against the railing. The cold would press gently against my hands. Then a light appeared, not in the sky, on the ground. A pale blue glow drifted silently between the distant fields. Another joined it, then a third. They moved together without sound, weaving across the farmland far below. For a moment I wondered whether they were vehicles. But no roads crossed that part of the valley. The lights continued their slow journey, never climbing, never falling, only gliding over the earth. I watched until they faded beyond a low hill. The valley returned to darkness. I went back inside. The fire had burned lower, filling the room with gentle warmth and the comforting scent of cedar smoke. I poured another cup of tea and settled into the worn leather chair beside the fireplace. That was when I noticed the guest book. It rested on a small table near the window. Curiosity got the better of me. Visitors had been signing it for years. Families, hikers, couples celebrating anniversaries. Their messages were ordinary. Beautiful sunrise. The snow was perfect. We'll definitely return. I smiled as I turned another page. Then another. Near the back of the book, my name appeared, written clearly across the page. The handwriting looked unmistakably mine. I stared at it. The date beside it was 5 years old. My message was brief. The lights return tonight. I think next time I'll understand. I read it again. Every letter matched the way I crossed my own T, the way I curved my Y. Even the little habit I had of ending periods slightly above the line. I had never rented this cabin before. I was certain of it. I searched the earlier pages. Nothing, only that single entry. My hands had begun to tremble, not from fear, from uncertainty. How could I recognize handwriting that shouldn't exist? I remembered something my grandmother once told me while teaching me to write letters. A person's handwriting changes as they grow older. Mine had, slightly, but the writing in the guest book looked exactly like it did today. Not 5 years ago. Today. A log shifted inside the fireplace with a quiet crack. I looked toward the flames. When I turned back, the guest book had closed. I couldn't remember doing it. The room had grown strangely quiet. Even the wind outside had faded. I stepped back onto the porch. Snow continued falling in slow, silent flakes. The valley below was hidden beneath darkness once again. No lights, no movement, only the faint outline of distant fields beneath the moon. I decided to sleep. Morning would make everything seem smaller, more reasonable. It usually did. I woke just after dawn. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the cabin with soft gold. The fire had gone out. The guest book still rested on the table. Open. My name remained on the page, exactly where I had left it. I packed my belongings quickly. The strange entry was unsettling enough that I no longer felt like staying another night. Coffee remained half-finished on the kitchen counter as I carried my bags outside. The morning air was bright and clear. I walked toward my truck, then stopped. The road was gone. The narrow mountain road I had driven the evening before had simply ended. Beyond the cabin lay untouched snow stretching across the mountainside. No tire tracks, no gravel, no path leading down into the valley. Only smooth white snow glistening beneath the winter sun. I turned slowly in every direction. The cabin stood exactly where it should. The mountain surrounded it. The valley rested far below. Everything remained unchanged. Everything except the road that had brought me there. As I stood listening to the deep mountain silence, I noticed one final line written beneath my name in the guest book through the cabin window. I was certain it hadn't been there before. It read, "You won't need the road the next time." The telephone pole stood by itself at the edge of an empty pasture, a mile beyond the last farmhouse on Old Mercer Road. I noticed it for the first time on a bitter night in late December. Snow covered the fields in long, uneven blankets, softening every fence line until the land looked almost untouched. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving only my headlights to cut through the darkness as I drove along the narrow road. I almost missed the pole. It leaned slightly toward the field, older than the others that lined the highway farther back. Its weatherwood had darkened with age, and a single wire stretched away into the distance before disappearing against the night. My truck radio lost its signal as I passed. Only a wash of static remained. Then the static stopped, not because the station returned, because I heard voices. More than one. They overlapped softly, too quiet to understand. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled onto the shoulder and switched off the engine. The voices continued. I stepped outside. The air felt strangely warm for the middle of winter, carrying the faint scent of heated electrical wires after a summer storm. It didn't belong there. Snow should have smelled clean and sharp. Instead, the warmth seemed to gather around the old telephone pole alone. The voices became clearer as I approached. They weren't arguing. They weren't whispering secrets. They sounded like ordinary conversations taking place behind a closed door. A laugh, a question, someone saying goodnight, fragments of lives drifting through the wire above my head. Then every voice faded. A telephone began ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound wasn't coming from my truck. It seemed to travel down the wooden pole itself. Before I could think better of it, my phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. No caller ID, only the word, unknown. I stood looking at the screen for several long moments. Finally, I answered. "Hello." Silence greeted me first. Then a calm voice. "Have you finally remembered?" The question settled over me like falling snow. "I think you called the wrong person." "I never do." The voice sounded neither old nor young, neither kind nor cruel, simply familiar in a way I couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Who is this?" A long pause followed. "I asked you that first." The line went silent. I looked at the screen. The call had ended. My reflection stared back at me from the dark display. My father used to tell me never to return calls from numbers I didn't recognize. He said real emergencies always found another way to reach you. Standing beside that lonely pole, I wondered if some messages were never meant to be answered at all. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The warmth around the pole had already begun to fade. I turned toward the truck. The phone rang again. Same screen, same single word. Unknown. Against my better judgment, I answered. This time, nothing, not even breathing. I listened for nearly a minute before lowering the phone. The call disconnected by itself. The old wire overhead gave a faint vibration. Not loud, just enough to notice. A breeze moved across the snow. It carried no sound, no scent, only quiet. I climbed back into the truck and started the engine. The radio remained silent. Not static, not music, nothing. I drove away slowly, watching the telephone pole shrink inside the rearview mirror. After half a mile, the radio crackled. I expected another voice. Instead, an ordinary weather report filled the speakers. The moment almost made me laugh. Perhaps exhaustion had caught up with me after all. Then my phone rang a third time. I didn't answer. It continued ringing until I reached the next crossroads. The sound finally stopped. Relief settled over me. It lasted less than a minute. From somewhere beyond the road, a telephone began ringing again. Not from my pocket, not from the truck, from inside the snow-covered field. I stopped the truck without thinking. The ringing continued, slow, steady, as though an old telephone waited among the frozen grass. No house stood nearby, no utility box, nothing that could explain it. The sound drifted farther into the darkness. One ring, then another, always just beyond where my headlights reached. For one brief moment, I almost stepped out to follow it. Then I remembered every impossible place I had already visited. The cornfields, the bridge, the greenhouse, the farmhouse basement. Each one had offered the same quiet invitation. Come a little closer. Learn one more thing. I rested my hands on the steering wheel instead. The ringing continued for several minutes before fading into the night. I drove home without looking back. Weeks later, I checked my phone records. No calls had come through that evening. Not one. Sometimes, when winter settles over the fields and the world grows very still, I pass that road again. The old telephone pole is always there, leaning just a little more each year. I never stop anymore, because every time I drive by, my phone stays perfectly silent, and somewhere deep in the empty field, another one begins to ring. The motel appeared just after midnight, glowing softly beside an empty stretch of highway where the next town was still 30 miles away. Snow had been falling since sunset, not heavily, just enough to soften the edges of the road and hide the fields beyond the fence lines. My windshield wipers moved in a slow rhythm while the heater filled the cab with welcome warmth. I had planned to keep driving until morning. Then the engine began to lose power. It wasn't dramatic, only a quiet hesitation every few miles. I decided not to risk it. The motel's faded sign flickered once as I pulled into the parking lot. Sleeping Pines Motel. The name felt oddly fitting. The building formed a long row of identical rooms beneath a weathered roof. Every window glowed with warm yellow light, and curtains hung neatly behind each one. It looked busy, comfortably busy, yet the parking lot was empty. Not a single car. No tire tracks except my own. I sat for a moment with the engine idling. Perhaps everyone had arrived before the snowfall. Perhaps there was another parking area behind the building. Reasonable explanations came easily. Believing them took more effort. I stepped out into the cold. The air carried the clean smell of fresh snow, mixed with the comforting scent of clean laundry drifting from somewhere inside the motel. It reminded me of Sunday afternoons when my mother hung sheets outside to dry. Even in winter, if the sun was bright enough, she always insisted fresh air made a home feel kinder. That memory stayed with me as I walked toward the office. A small bell rested on the front desk. There was no clerk, no television playing in the corner, no paperwork, only a brass key already waiting beside the register. Room 12. A folded note lay beneath it. You look tired. I frowned. No name, no signature. Still, after a long drive in an unreliable truck, sleep sounded better than questions. Room 12 stood halfway down the hallway. As I unlocked the door, I noticed every room around me was closed. Soft light glowed beneath each one, but I heard no voices, no footsteps, nothing at all. The hallway felt comfortably warm. The smell of fresh linen lingered in the air, as though someone had finished washing every blanket only moments earlier. Inside, my room looked ordinary. A neatly made bed, a wooden dresser, a small television, one lamp glowing beside the window. Everything appeared clean, almost too clean. I set my overnight bag on the bed, then stopped. The zipper was already open. Slowly I looked inside. My clothes had been folded and placed neatly into the dresser drawers. My toothbrush rested beside the sink. Even the paperback I had packed for the drive lay open on the bedside table, a bookmark tucked between the exact pages I planned to read. Someone had unpacked everything. I stood perfectly still. I knew I hadn't. For a long moment, I wondered if exhaustion had finally begun playing tricks on me. I checked the truck keys in my pocket. Still there. Wallet. Still there. Everything else already arranged. My grandmother had a habit of unpacking the moment she arrived anywhere. She said a suitcase left closed made a place feel temporary. Looking around that motel room, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone had decided I was staying much longer than I intended. I walked back into the hallway. Every door remained shut. I knocked gently on room 11. No answer. Room 13. Nothing. Only silence stretching from one end of the hallway to the other. The office was empty when I returned. The brass bell remained exactly where I had found it. This time I rang it. Its clear tone echoed softly through the building. No one came. I checked the guest register, lying open on the counter. Every room had been marked as occupied. Each signature looked different. Different names. Different handwriting. One room remained unreadable. Room 12. The ink across that line had been smeared until only a single letter remained. The lights flickered once, then steadied again. I decided I had seen enough. I hurried back outside. The parking lot hadn't changed. Still only my truck. No fresh tracks. No footprints crossing the snow. I reached for the driver's door. Locked. I pressed the button on my keys. Nothing happened. Again. Nothing. The truck sat only a few feet away. Yet it refused to unlock. A soft click sounded behind me. The motel's lobby door had closed by itself. I turned. The lights inside still glowed warmly. The hallway beyond looked exactly as before. Quiet. Inviting. The scent of clean laundry drifted out once more. Gentle. Comforting. As though the building already knew I belonged inside. I walked back to the office and tried the handle. It wouldn't move. Not locked with force. Just unwilling to open. I looked through the glass. The brass key for room 12 rested neatly on the counter again, exactly where it had been when I arrived. Only now, another handwritten note lay beside it. Welcome back. The scarecrow appeared during the first week of October. I noticed it while carrying groceries from my truck after work, just as the last light of the day was slipping behind the hills. Across the road from my house stretched an old soybean field that had been left untouched for several seasons. Weeds had claimed most of it, and the weathered fence leaned a little farther every year. No one farmed that land anymore. Yet there it stood, a scarecrow. Its clothes were faded with age, patched together from worn denim and an old flannel shirt. Dry straw spilled from its sleeves and collar, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves that had baked in the sun for weeks. What caught my attention wasn't its appearance. It was the direction it faced. Instead of looking over the empty field, it faced my house. I stood in the driveway longer than I meant to. Perhaps whoever had built it simply hadn't cared which direction it pointed. That explanation satisfied me for exactly one evening. The next morning, while collecting my newspaper, I glanced toward the field again. The scarecrow had turned. Only a little, no more than a few degrees. Enough that its stitched face now seemed aimed directly at my front porch. I walked across the road before breakfast. The grass brushed softly against my boots as I crossed the abandoned field. Up close, the scarecrow looked ordinary. A wooden post, old clothes, twine holding everything together. Its painted face had almost completely faded, leaving only two uneven black circles where eyes had once been. There were no footprints, no fresh holes in the ground. The post sat firmly buried beneath the earth. I pushed against it. It didn't move. I laughed quietly at myself. The human mind is good at finding patterns where none exist. By evening, I had almost forgotten about it. Until I closed my curtains before bed, the scarecrow seemed closer. Not physically, only because it had turned again. Now it faced the front window of my living room. The following morning, I visited my neighbor, Mrs. Ellison. She had lived across the valley for nearly 40 years and knew every field better than anyone. That scarecrow over on Miller's place. She smiled before I finished. What about it? Has someone been moving it? Her expression changed confusion. It hasn't moved. I've watched it turn every day. She looked toward the abandoned field. It's faced the road for as long as I can remember. I followed her gaze. The scarecrow stood exactly where I had left it, facing my house. Mrs. Ellison saw nothing unusual. I thanked her and walked home without mentioning it again. My father once told me that arguing with someone else's memory was like trying to hold water in your hands. No matter how certain you felt, it always slipped away, so I kept my thoughts to myself. Each evening, the scarecrow turned. Never much, just enough that I could notice. The movement was impossible to catch. I tried watching from my porch one night, with a blanket around my shoulders and a mug of hot tea warm in my hands. Hours passed. Nothing changed. The stars drifted overhead. A cool breeze stirred the dry grass. The scarecrow remained perfectly still. I finally gave up and went inside. The next morning, it had turned again. Now it faced the bedroom window where I had been sleeping. I stopped mentioning it to anyone. There seemed little point. No one else believed it had moved at all. The days became weeks. The slow turning continued. By the end of the month, the scarecrow no longer looked toward the house. It looked directly at me, no matter where I stood. Front porch, driveway, mailbox. The faded face always seemed quietly fixed in my direction. One rainy afternoon, I decided enough was enough. I crossed the field carrying a shovel. If someone wanted to play tricks, they could build another scarecrow somewhere else. The ground around the post was soft from recent rain. It should have come free easily. Instead, the post refused to budge. It felt anchored far deeper than its size allowed. After several minutes of digging, I uncovered nothing. No buried base. No support. The wooden post simply disappeared into darkness beneath the soil, as though the earth had chosen not to end. I stepped back, covered the hole again, walked home without looking behind me. That night, heavy rain drummed gently against the roof. I slept poorly. Before sunrise, an uneasy feeling woke me. The house had become unusually quiet. No rain, no wind. I looked through the bedroom window. The field was empty. The scarecrow was gone. Only the post hole remained. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt less relieved than I expected. The following morning, Mrs. Ellison knocked on my door. She looked troubled. Did someone finally take it down? The scarecrow? She nodded. It was always such a strange thing. I hesitated. I thought you said it never moved. I did. She looked past me toward the empty field. But I don't remember it ever facing your house. After she left, I stood alone on the porch. The abandoned field stretched quietly beneath the autumn sun. Nothing stood among the weeds anymore. That evening, while locking my front door, I happened to glance toward the living room mirror. Behind my reflection, a few pieces of dry straw rested on the hallway floor, leading deeper into the house. I never followed them. The hill was known by a name that no one could explain. People called it Silent Rise. It wasn't the tallest hill in the county, nor the hardest to climb. From the road below, it looked almost ordinary, covered in winter grass and scattered with a handful of old oak trees that had somehow survived decades of storms. Still, people avoided it after dark. When I asked why, the answers were always the same. A quiet shrug, a change of subject, or the simple words, "You'll understand if you stay long enough." By then, I had already seen too many places that refused to obey reason. An impossible basement window, a motel that unpacked my suitcase, a bridge where my reflection walked away. Part of me hoped this hill would finally give me an answer. Another part hoped it wouldn't. I arrived just before midnight, on the coldest night of the year. A hard frost covered the grass, making each step sparkle beneath my flashlight. The air smelled clean, carrying the crisp scent that always comes before dawn during the hard winter. My breath drifted quietly into the darkness as I climbed. The higher I walked, the farther the world seemed to fall away. Farmhouses became tiny points of light. Roads disappeared beneath the rolling land. The fields where so many strange things had begun stretched silently beneath the stars. When I reached the summit, I switched off my flashlight. The moon had not yet risen. Above me, the sky looked endless. Thousands of stars covered it from horizon to horizon. For several minutes, nothing happened. The cold settled into my jacket. The grass whispered softly around my boots. I found a flat stone near the top of the hill and sat down. My grandfather always said the sky looked larger in winter. He believed cold nights revealed things that warm evenings kept hidden. I smiled at the memory. He would have liked this place. Quiet, uncrowded, patient enough for long thoughts. Then one star disappeared. I frowned. Perhaps a cloud had crossed it. Another vanished. Then another, not blinking out. Simply gone. I looked across the sky. The darkness spread slowly outward, swallowing one cluster of stars after another. There were no clouds, no mist, nothing moving overhead, only an emptiness growing where the stars had been. Within a minute, half the sky had gone black. The remaining stars seemed brighter by comparison. Then they disappeared too, one by one, until nothing remained. No moon, no stars, only a vast darkness stretching above the hill. I had never imagined a night could become so empty. It wasn't frightening in the way I expected. It was quieter than fear. The kind of silence that makes a person realize how much comfort the smallest points of light can bring. I stood slowly. The valley below had vanished into the same darkness. Not hidden, absent, as though the world beyond the hill had stepped away for a little while. I listened. There were no insects, no breeze, no distant engines. Even my own breathing sounded strangely small. Then a voice spoke behind me. "Thank you for waiting." It wasn't loud. It didn't startle me. It felt almost as though someone had continued a conversation that had paused many years earlier. I didn't turn around. For some reason, I knew the voice wasn't asking for my attention, only my presence. I didn't know I was waiting. I answered, "You always were." The reply carried no anger, no joy, only certainty. I closed my eyes for a moment. My father's photograph, the lights above the fields, the impossible guest book, the questions asked through an old telephone. Each memory seemed less like separate events and more like pages from the same story. I don't remember. The words barely left my lips. "You will..." The silence returned. Gentle, endless. I opened my eyes. The stars began returning. Not all at once. One small point of light appeared above the eastern horizon. Then another. Soon a familiar constellation stretched across the sky once more, exactly where they belonged. The valley returned. The distant farmhouses glowed warmly. The world felt whole again. I turned around. The hilltop stood empty. Only my footprints marked the frosted grass. Or so I believed. As I started back down the slope, I noticed something that made me stop. There was only one trail of footprints. They led upward. None led back down. I looked behind me. The summit rested quietly beneath the stars. The frost remained smooth and untouched where I had been standing only moments before. It was as though I had never left the top of the hill. I didn't try to understand it anymore. Some questions had stopped asking for answers. When I reached my truck, dawn was still hours away. The sky looked perfectly ordinary. The stars shone with their familiar patterns. Yet every time I looked up afterward, I carried a memory of that impossible emptiness. Not because the darkness had frightened me, but because, for a few quiet moments, it had known my name before I remembered my own. The road to Miller's corn looked smaller than I remembered. Winter had sailed across the countryside, leaving the fields pale beneath a gray afternoon sky. Most of the stalks had long since been harvested, but the old Miller property remained untouched, just as I had the night I first saw the pale blue light drifting between the rows. Nearly a year had passed since then, a year of impossible places. The farmhouse with the voice beneath its porch, the bridge where my reflection chose not to follow me, the hill where the stars quietly disappeared. Every road had led me back here. Part of me wanted answers. Another part had already begun to understand that answers often ask for something in return. I parked beside the same weathered gate. The mailbox still leaned at its familiar angle. Its faded paint had peeled away even more, exposing bare beneath. This time, I didn't open it. Some memories are heavy enough without proving they still exist. The fields stretched quietly before me. The dry stalks whispered against one another as a gentle breeze crossed the land. The air carried the soft smell of winter grass warming beneath the afternoon sun. The scent felt strangely familiar. Not because I remembered this place, because it reminded me of somewhere else, a place I couldn't quite reach. My grandmother once told me that certain smells could unlock memories before the mind was ready for them. Fresh bread, old books, spring rain. She believed they opened little doors inside us. standing beside that forgotten field. I wondered what door had just begun to move. I stepped through the gate. The earth felt firm beneath my boots. Unlike my first visit, I wasn't searching for glowing lights or strange footprints. I simply walked. The rows seemed wider now, more welcoming, almost peaceful. A crow lifted quietly into skies somewhere in the distance, leaving the field wrapped in silence once again. Then I heard someone speak. "You're late." The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't hidden. It came from somewhere ahead, carried gently through the rows. I stopped. There was no fear, only recognition. "I got lost," I answered before I realized I had spoken. A soft laugh drifted through the field. "You always do." I continued walking. The corn no longer felt endless. Instead, each turn between the rows seemed quietly familiar, as though my feet already knew where they were going. The feeling should have frightened me. Instead, it brought an unexpected calm. The farther I walked, the more small memories began to surface. Not clear memories, only fragments. A pale light above tall grass. Standing beside someone whose face I couldn't remember. Looking upward without fear. None of it belonged to my childhood. Yet each image carried the comfortable feeling of something once deeply known. I reached a small clearing hidden within the field. There was no circle pressed into the earth. No strange marks. Only open ground bathed in the fading light of evening. The voices returned. More than one this time. Gentle, quiet, like old friends speaking across a room. "Welcome back. We've missed you. You remember the road." None of them sounded unfamiliar. That was the part one struggled with most. I should have been hearing strangers. Instead, every voice carried the warmth of someone whose name rested just beyond memory. I closed my eyes. For one long moment, I let the silence settle around me. It wasn't empty. It felt full, as though countless quiet moments had gathered there long before I arrived. When I opened my eyes again, the clearing looked unchanged. Only the light had shifted. The sun rested lower now, painting the tops of the stalks in soft gold. I thought about my father, about the photograph from the harvest festival, the way he had looked toward the figure behind us. Not frightened, not surprised, simply accepting. Perhaps he hadn't been looking at a stranger. Perhaps he had recognized an old friend. The thought settled gently inside me. Not a certainty, only possibility. A breeze crossed the clearing. The dry stalks moved together with a faint rustling that reminded me of pages turning in a well-loved book. For the first time in months, I stopped asking myself what these places wanted from me. Instead, another question quietly appeared. Why had I spent so long believing they meant me harm? The voices faded, one by one, until only the wind remained. Dusk slowly gathered across the field. The road back to my truck waited beyond the rows. I looked toward it, then back toward the heart of the corn. Leaving no longer felt urgent. The world beyond the gate suddenly seemed distant, busy, unfamiliar. Here the silence knew me. Here, I no longer felt like someone searching for answers, only someone remembering them. As darkness settled over the field, I finally turned toward the road. I walked only a few steps before pausing. The urge to keep going quietly disappeared. Without thinking, I looked back one last time. The rows had already closed behind me, not trapping me, simply returning to the way they had always been. For the first time since this journey began, I couldn't honestly say whether I was walking away from the field or whether I had only dreamed of ever leaving it at all. Morning arrived with a soft golden light that spread slowly across the countryside. I had spent the night in my truck beside Miller's old property, waking before sunrise without needing an alarm. Sleep had come easily for the first time in months. There had been no strange dreams, no voices calling through impossible windows, only the quiet comfort of wind moving across open land. When I stepped outside, the air carried the fresh scent of ripe wheat warming beneath the early sun. Harvest had reached the neighboring farms. Fields that stood green only weeks before now rolled across the hills in waves of gold, their heads bending gently beneath a light breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a combine worked steadily, its low engine fading in and out as it crossed the land. The world felt wonderfully ordinary, Yet something continued drawing my attention toward the largest wheat field beyond the old county road. I couldn't explain why. It simply felt familiar. I crossed a narrow ditch and walked through the entrance where farmers' tire tracks disappeared into the grain. The wheat rose nearly to my shoulders. Its dry stalks brushed softly against my jacket, making a gentle sound that reminded me of turning pages in a quiet library. My mother loved wheat fields. She used to stop the car every summer just to run her fingers across the grain before harvest. She always smiled afterward, saying that some places carried peace so naturally they didn't need words. As I walked deeper into the field, I finally understood what she meant. The farther I went, the quieter my thoughts became. Then I found it, a perfect circle, hidden beneath the standing wheat. The stalks around its edge remained untouched, forming a smooth wall that enclosed a space perhaps 30 feet across. Inside, the grain had been pressed gently to the ground without breaking. No tire tracks, no footprints, only a perfect circle resting beneath the morning sky. I stepped inside. The moment my boot touched the flattened wheat, a memory appeared, not like a dream, not like imagination. It arrived complete. I saw a little girl laughing beside a wooden fence while holding a red ribbon against the wind. I knew the sound of her laughter. I knew the warmth of the afternoon. I knew she had lost the ribbon only moments later. Then the memory disappeared. I frowned. I had never met that child. Another step, a different memory. An elderly man quietly repairing a pocket watch beneath a porch lamp while rain tapped against the roof. He hummed a tune I somehow recognized. His hands moved slowly. Patiently, the memory faded. Again, it wasn't mine, yet it carried the strange weight of something deeply personal. I continued walking through the circle. Each step uncovered another life. A young couple dancing beneath summer fireworks. A farmer holding his newborn son for the first time. An old woman reading a letter she had waited years to receive. None of them belonged to me. Still, each memory filled me with quiet warmth instead of confusion. It felt less like stealing someone else's past, more like being trusted with it. My grandmother believed memories were living things. She often said they didn't disappear after people were gone. They simply wait, she used to tell me, for someone willing to carry them. Standing inside that silent circle, I wondered if she had understood far more than she ever admitted. The morning breeze moved gently across the wheat. Every stalk around the circle swayed together. Only those beneath my feet remained perfectly still. I closed my eyes. More memories drifted quietly through my thoughts. Faces without names. Voices speaking languages I couldn't understand. Hands reaching toward unfamiliar stars. None of it frightened me anymore. For months, I had searched for explanations. Now, explanations seemed much smaller than experience. Perhaps not everything needed to be solved. Perhaps some things only asked to be witnessed. I opened my eyes again. The sunlight had climbed higher. The circle appeared exactly as before, peaceful, undisturbed. I turned toward the opening where I had entered. There wasn't one. The wall of standing wheat surrounded me completely. I walked slowly around the edge. Nothing. No gap. No path leading back to the road. The circle had quietly closed behind me. A few months earlier, I would have panicked. I would have searched desperately for a way out. Instead, I smiled, not because I understood, because I had stopped believing I was trapped. The breeze returned. The wheat leaned gently outward in one place. Not enough to reveal an exit, only enough to suggest a direction. I chose not to follow it. The distant sound of the combine had faded. Bird song drifted across the fields instead. Warm sunlight rested across the flattened grain. For a long while, I simply stood there, listening, remembering lives that had never been mine, feeling strangely grateful they had found me. By the time the shadows began shortening toward noon, I realized something with complete certainty. I was no longer searching for the road back, and when I finally looked around once more, I discovered I had quietly stopped expecting there to be one. The visitor came on the last night of winter. By then, I had stopped measuring time by calendars. The days seemed to flow together in quiet ways, each sunrise leading me through another forgotten road or another empty field where familiar questions no longer felt urgent. I still returned to town for supplies now and then, but the places that once felt like home had begun to seem strangely distant. I found myself spending more time beneath open skies than beneath roofs. That evening, I walked to the edge of the old pasture beyond Miller's corn just as the sun slipped below the horizon. The grass had not yet turned green, and patches of frost still lingered in the shaded places. Far away, silent clouds gathered around the western hills. The air carried the faint scent of copper after distant lightning. The storm never came closer. It simply waited beyond the horizon, where the fading light slowly gave way to night. I sat on the same fallen fence rail, where I had rested many times before. The field stretched quietly around me. Nothing moved. Nothing called my name. For the first time since this journey had begun, I wasn't waiting for anything to happen. I was simply there. My father used to enjoy evenings like this. He believed silence became easier to understand if you stopped asking it to speak. I think I finally understood what he meant. The first pale blue light appeared just after midnight. It drifted above the far end of the pasture with the same quiet grace I had seen many times before. Then another joined it, then a third. They remained together for only a few moments before fading into the darkness. When they disappeared, someone stood where they had been. The figure was tall, not impossibly so, only taller than anyone I had ever met. Its outline seemed almost ordinary beneath the starlight, wrapped in something that moved gently despite the still night. I could never quite focus on its face, not because it was hidden, because my eyes never seemed to settle there. It didn't frighten me. Strangely, it never had. We stood looking at one another across the field. Neither of us moved. Eventually it spoke. "You're no longer afraid." Its voice carried no echo. It sounded calm, almost thoughtful. I answered, "For a long time. You fear forgetting." I considered that, then shook my head. I think I feared remembering. The figure remained quiet. The fields around us rested beneath a sky, full of familiar stars. After a while it spoke again. "Why do humans fear being remembered?" The question caught me by surprise. I had expected answers, not another mystery. I searched for words, thought about my family, my childhood home, the people I had loved and lost. "I don't know," I admitted softly. "Maybe—" I paused. "Maybe we're afraid that someone will remember the parts of us we tried to leave behind." The figure tilted its head slightly. "And the parts you hope would remain?" I smiled without meaning to. "I suppose we hope they'll stay with someone." The breeze carried the smell of dry grass across the pasture. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once before the night grew quiet again. The figure looked toward the stars. "You remember more than before." "Not enough." "There is no enough." The words settled over the field with surprising gentleness. For months, I had believed memory was something to recover, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Now it felt more like a river, always moving, never truly finished. My grandmother used to say memories belong to everyone who carries them. The figure looked back at me. She listened well. A small laugh escaped before I could stop it. "I've started thinking that everyone in my family knew more than they ever told me. They hope you would choose." "Choose what?" Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence between us felt comfortable, not empty. Finally, the figure answered, "To remember without being asked." I looked across the fields where this journey had begun. The lonely roads, the quiet bridges, the impossible places that had slowly changed from frightening to familiar. Perhaps none of them had been chasing me. Perhaps they had only been waiting. The eastern sky began to pale. Morning was approaching. The figure noticed it before I did. "It is time." "For what?" "To leave." I felt an unexpected sadness. Not because I feared being alone. Because I realized I would miss a conversation that had barely begun. "I still have questions." "I know." "Will I see you again?" The figure looked toward the brightening horizon. "You always have." The first rays of sunlight reached across the pasture for a brief moment. They passed through the place where the visitor stood. When the light settled fully across the field, the figure was gone. No footprints remained. No strange lights. Only morning arriving exactly as it always had. I stood there for several minutes before turning toward home. As I walked away, I found myself smiling, not because I had finally received answers, because I had discovered that some questions become kinder once you stop demanding they end. The road home felt shorter than I remembered. Spring had settled gently over the countryside by the time I turned onto the old lane where I had grown up. Wild grass lined the cracked pavement, and the maple trees that shaded the driveway had begun filling with fresh green leaves. The house stood exactly where it always had, quiet beneath the afternoon sun, waiting with the same patient stillness I had known as a child. No one lived there anymore. After my father passed away, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I simply locked the door, kept the key, and told myself I would return when I was ready. Standing on the porch that afternoon, I wasn't sure anyone is ever truly ready to return home. The old wooden door opened with a gentle creak. A familiar scent greeted me at once. Old books. The smell drifted softly from the shelves lining the living room walls, carrying years of quiet evenings, worn paper, and polished wood. My father collected books the way some people collected photographs. He believed every story left something behind for the next person who opened it. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Everything seemed untouched. His favorite chair still faced the fireplace. My mother's little ceramic bird rested on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. Even the clock in the hallway had stopped at the same time. I remembered winding it for the last time. The house felt empty, yet not lonely. I walked from room to room without speaking. Each corner seemed to offer another memory. My bedroom still held the faded quilt my grandmother had sewn by hand. The kitchen table carried tiny scratches where my father had sharpened pocket knives while telling stories about places he claimed never to have visited. Back then, I believed he was making them up. Now, I wasn't so certain. As evening settled outside, I noticed something unusual in the hallway. A family photograph hung beside the staircase. It showed my parents standing on the front porch years before I was born. I smiled. Then I walked into the kitchen to make tea. When I returned a few minutes later, the photograph had changed. I stopped. A young boy now stood between them. Me. I frowned and stepped closer. The picture looked completely natural, as though it had always been taken that way. I reached up and touched the frame. The glass was cool beneath my fingertips. I remembered clearly. That photograph had never included me. I told myself memory could be unreliable. Perhaps I had simply forgotten. Still, the feeling stayed with me. I continued exploring the house. Every so often, another photograph caught my attention. A fishing trip where my father smiled toward someone standing just outside the frame. A birthday party where an unfamiliar shadow rested near the garden fence. Each time I looked away and returned, something small had changed. A different expression, an extra chair, another figure standing quietly in the background. Nothing dramatic, only enough to leave doubt behind. My grandmother always insisted photographs captured more than faces. They remember moments better than people do, she used to say. As a child, I laughed whenever she said things like that. Now her words echoed through every quiet room. Darkness settled outside. I switched on a single lamp in the living room. Its warm glow filled the house with gentle comfort. I sat in my father's old chair and watched the silence gather around me. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about the lights, or the fields, or the visitor. I was thinking about him. How often he had paused before answering simple questions. How carefully he had chosen his words. Perhaps he hadn't been hiding the truth. Perhaps he had been waiting until I could hear it. The thought stayed with me until a loose floorboard creaked beneath my feet. I looked down. The sound had come from directly in front of the fireplace. Curious, I knelt and pressed gently against the old board. It lifted more easily than I expected. Beneath it rested a small metal box wrapped in faded cloth. Inside lay a single envelope. My name appeared on the front in my father's handwriting. I opened it carefully. The paper had yellowed with age. Only a few lines filled the page. If you're reading this, then they trusted you enough to remember. I wanted to explain everything. But some things cannot be taught. They must be recognized. When you stop fearing them, you'll discover they were never hiding from you. No signature was needed. I knew every letter. I folded the note and held it quietly in my hands. Outside, night settled over the fields beyond the house. The old photographs remained still on the walls. No more changes. No unfamiliar figures. Only my family looking back through years that suddenly felt much closer than before. As I replaced the floorboard, I noticed one final photograph resting on the mantel. It showed my father standing alone in the backyard. Or so I thought. When I carried it closer to the lamp, I realized he wasn't alone at all. Someone stood beside him, tall, peaceful, looking toward the stars. This time, my father wasn't looking at the visitor. They were both looking toward the camera, as though they had known. One day, I would be standing there too. It began where it had always been waiting. The road to Miller's Corn looked almost unchanged beneath the soft light of early summer. Wildflowers had returned to the ditches beside the pavement, their quiet colors bending gently beneath the midnight breeze. The field stretched toward the horizon in calm rows, silver beneath the moon. Just as they had the first night, I pulled over after seeing a pale blue light drifting through the corn. So much had changed since then, and somehow, nothing had changed at all. I parked my truck beside the old wooden gate without switching on a flashlight. I didn't need one anymore. The path felt familiar beneath my boots. The night air carried the gentle scent of wildflowers, mixing with the cool breath of the open fields. It reminded me of childhood walks with my mother, when she would stop every few minutes to admire flowers growing where no one had planted them. She always believed the most beautiful things rarely asked to be noticed. I understood that now. The weathered mailbox still leaned toward the road. Its door hung slightly open. I smiled as I passed it. There was no need to look inside. Whatever waited there had already said everything it needed to say. Beyond the gate, the rows of corn stood tall once again. Harvest was still weeks away. The stalks swayed only enough to whisper softly against one another before settling back into silence. I stepped forward. The path that had once twisted without reason now stretched straight ahead. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Only welcome. My father had once told me that every person spends their life walking towards something they cannot yet name. For years, I thought he meant dreams. Or purpose, standing among those familiar rows. I finally realized he had been speaking about recognition. The farther I walked, the lighter everything became. The weight of unanswered questions slowly lifted away. The strange places, the impossible voices, the memories that belonged to strangers. None of them felt disconnected anymore. They were chapters of the same quiet story, one that had never been trying to frighten me, only to remind me. The rows of corn began to separate, not with force, not with any sound. They simply leaned gently away from one another, opening a narrow passage where no path had existed before. Moonlight rested upon the ground ahead. I followed it without hurry. There was no fear left inside me, only curiosity wrapped in peace. The clearing appeared exactly where I remembered it. Small, still, silent. At its center stood the figure, the same tall shape from the photograph, from the harvest festival, from the pasture beneath the stars. It hadn't changed. Neither had the calm that surrounded it. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Words seemed far too small for a place like this. The figure looked toward me. Its face remained impossible to describe, yet something inside me recognized it with complete certainty. Not because I finally understood what it was, because I stopped needing to. You came back. Its voice carried the same gentle calm I had heard before. I always was. The answer surprised even me. The figure inclined its head slightly, as you promised. A memory opened quietly inside my mind. Not one memory. Many, standing beneath unfamiliar skies, filled with stars that moved differently than ours, walking through fields that stretched farther than sight, listening to voices without language, watching countless travelers arrive, become frightened, then slowly remember. None of the memories belonged to one lifetime, yet they belonged to me. Not every detail, only the feeling, the quiet certainty that I had walked this path before. More than once, my grandmother's words returned with perfect clarity. Memories don't disappear. They wait for someone willing to carry them. At last, I understood. The visitor had never come to take anything from us. It had been keeping something safe. Every kindness, every farewell, every quiet moment that would otherwise have been forgotten. The field had never been a trap. It had always been a place of remembering. The first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Birdsong began somewhere beyond the corn. The figure looked toward the brightening sky. "It is your turn." I nodded. There was nothing left to ask, nothing left to fear. I stepped forward. The distance between us quietly disappeared, not because either of us moved, because it no longer existed. The morning light grew warmer. The rows of corn swayed once beneath the breeze before becoming still again. When the first traveler drove along the lonely county road after sunrise, they slowed beside the old Miller field. Perhaps they had noticed nothing more than the beauty of the morning. Perhaps they were simply tired after a long night. Or perhaps they caught sight of a lone silhouette standing peacefully among the corn. Not calling, not waving, only waiting. They drove on after a few moments, shaking their head as though dismissing a trick of the light. The field became quiet again. The wildflowers bent gently in the morning breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark welcomed the new day. And far beyond the road, where memory and silence met beneath the open sky, someone waited with the same quiet patience that had once been waiting for me.